You're listening to Online Pet Health Podcasts with Dr. Megan Kelly. Continuing education for veterinarian rehabilitation therapists. Learn more at onlinepethealth.com.
Hey Vetrehabers, today I chat to Tony Nevin from Zoo Austin, the UK. He is an osteopath and he treats animals, but he still treats people too. If you're interested in hearing about osteopathy in elephants, you can go check out episode 33. It was a great interview that I did with Tony a few years ago. He has recently co-authored a textbook called Animal Osteopathy and also has his own podcast called Tony Nevin Talks and The Missing Link. So we chat all things osteopathy, and we include diving into the topic of myofascial chains or links, how he uses thermal imaging, and he gives some great examples of how he uses it in wild animals. Tony Nevin is really one interesting guy. Before we head over to Tony's interview, a quick word from our sponsor. Choosing the right therapy laser and PEMF system for your practice are big decisions. And that's why Response System has been helping us to make the decision for over 35 years now. And they offer Class 3B and Class 4 lasers, as well as a full line of PEMF products. And these are designed for both small animals as well as horses. Conveniently, all of their systems are fully rechargeable and adapted for international grids. And if you want to find out more, you can go to responsesystem.com. You can also come and chat to Response System at the Vetrehab Summit. It's our online veterinary rehabilitation conference. It's on the 14th of November this year. There is free limited access, so go over to vetrehabsummit.com and find out more about it. Over to Tony. Hey, Tony, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you, Megan. It's a pleasure to be back again.
Now, Tony, obviously you joined us and it was episode 33 for those of you that don't remember Tony's previous podcast. And it was such an interesting podcast. We were talking about osteopathy in elephants. But for those people that don't know much about you, can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm a UK-based osteopath and originally trained to treat people, and very quickly realised that animals were suffering exactly the same problems that people were, but there didn't seem in the UK to be a system for these animals to get treated the same way we do. So I started looking into it and was surprised actually at how open the vets were in the region I lived, really to have somebody who was interested in helping them solve some of the cases that were confusing them. And anyone who as trained as a vet will know that you don't get masses of time looking at and discerning differences going on in the musculoskeletal system, certainly not with your hands. And something I was soon able to do was sort of bring these human skills to bear on the animals. But vice versa, I learned an awful lot from these early vets in what you could and couldn't do in the way of examining and observing the patient. And so for about 30 years now, I've been expanding this ability to work with vets, integrate with them, but also bring a lot of that stuff that I'm learning from the veterinary side back into my human work. And so the two are so intertwined, and that I'm the great thing is I never, ever stop learning. So it's been this magical tour that sort of spread out. And as you said, in episode 33, we were talking about elephants, and who would ever have thought osteopathy and elephants would go together? But conversely, osteopathy and treating dogs of all sort of breeds, shapes and sizes, and horses and livestock and birds and reptiles, because everywhere now people want to keep exotic pets, and we're discovering all the problems that they get, and the fact that osteopathy has got a massive amount to offer the veterinary profession in working together. So it is very much another string to the bow of animal care.
So the term osteopathy, and I think I asked this in episode 33, but for those listeners that haven't listened to that episode, it's sometimes confusing to people exactly what an osteopath does. So, we know what a chiropractor is, we know what a physiotherapist, and then there's the osteopath, and it's sort of like a little bit in between, but I think that you'd do a better job of explaining exactly what an osteopath does.
We're a strange bunch. the collective term for a group of osteopaths is a disagreement. That is, if you put enough of us together, we won't agree on what we do. But basically what we do is we look at the body framework, and rather than just looking at a specific injury, we look at how the individual has come to have a problem and what we need to do to return it back to where it can work at its optimum as a whole body. And that differs slightly from the physiotherapy approach, which generally is focused on there's a hip problem or an elbow problem, so you're dealing with that. And it differs slightly from the chiropractic one, which tends to look very much for symmetry of the individual. And the way we view things is very, very few things in nature are actually symmetrical, but what you want is freedom of movement in every plane and the ability for the individual to function normally for that individual. And so that's what we aim to do. So it does mean that treatment can't be terribly prescriptive, because you have to treat each patient as a unique being, regardless of the breed or species. And for me, that's what makes it absolutely fascinating and stops me from getting bored and complacent with what I do. Because although I've worked with many different species, every single one I see is a blank canvas.
So it reminds me a little bit about sort of the Chinese medicine approach. So like that everything is sort of connected, right?
Absolutely. You cannot have an effect on one part of the body without it rippling out and affecting the rest. And there have been some fascinating visuals done recently which try to explain these, and people can look them up on YouTube and that. And I think you've had some on your channel. But yes, if somebody, if an animal injures its neck and the muscles tighten on one side, that problem doesn't stop at the neck. The rest of the body is compensating for all of those imbalances and differences in tension, so that the individual can carry on functioning as normal as possible. But of course, that alters tension throughout the whole of it. And it's one of the big areas we're trying to communicate with vets, is that where the site of the most pain is generally speaking the weakest link in that chain of patterns that are going on through the body. That doesn't mean it's the primary area or the area that actually needs the most attention. And so it's a little bit like if you've got a burglar trying to break down your door, you don't want to just keep shoring up the door. You want to get rid of the burglar. So if we can get rid of the primary causation of the situation, then the weak link no longer becomes the weak link, and in generally speaking is no longer the most sensitive area. And so that's probably one of the main things we focus on.
Yeah, and I think from vets' perspective, so if I put myself back to when I studied, when we look at musculoskeletal conditions, we pretty much are trying to diagnose and find the area that is the problem and treat that specific area. Yeah. And as a vet rehab therapist now, having done more study and obviously more attuned to animals and how everything connects, we realize now sometimes when we see a forelimb lameness, it's actually a problem in the hind, and that's just a compensatory injury. And that's something I only learned later on once I became a vet rehab therapist. As a vet, I would just be treating that forelimb lameness, and that hind limb lameness was so subtle, maybe I didn't pick it up.
And it's whether it started in the limbs or whether the limbs have had to overcompensate because the back's got stiff. I mean, most of the time you look at horses when they're on their own, and it doesn't take them long before most of them get up to mischief, and they're hooling around and they slip and they get up and you can see they're stiff, but then they sort of walk it off in inverted commas. But of course, the resting state of some of those muscle spindles will have been altered in the back, and therefore the legs generally start changing their flight very subtly. But if you look at them under high speed filming and then slow it all down, you can then see the flight of the limbs alters slightly. And then it's not surprising if you get, degeneration in the hocks, or you get sort of altered tension in the suspensory ligaments and things like that. And it's those subtleties that we are trying to show the vets, that don't wait until you've got an absolute pathology in the limb. Get the body functioning normally, and you take the stress off those areas. Also, if you have got pathology in those limbs, still take the stress off them, because you don't want to accelerate the process. So it's not a do osteopathy or do veterinary. It's very much the two can integrate massively, and there's an awful lot we can do to prevent things getting bad enough. That there are enough animals out there to treat. Nobody's going to be able to work, but we do need to look more at prevention rather than sitting there waiting until a problem arrives at our door. And I think there's a huge amount we can do on the education side for owners of animals, carers of animals and things like that, so that they're not doing things that are adversely accelerating problems in certain regions of an animal that then it's going to have to compensate around.
Yeah, I mean, I really think that the skills of an osteopath or Vetrehab therapist, when you work together with a vet and we combine, we can make a really awesome team, because we offer something that the vets maybe don't, and the vets do things that maybe we can't. And one of the areas where I really think, like just now you're saying, if I think about when I was doing equine work and when I was studying, I remember doing all these lameness workups.
Yeah.
And we were really focused on the legs, right? Yeah. I mean, it's like there is a left fore lameness. And then we were like, okay, let's work up and down the leg and work out where it is. And, at times we couldn't. We would do nerve blocks. And, I mean, those days, so I'm giving away my age here, but maybe it was available, but I don't remember thermal cameras then. And I know you use a lot, and that's something we can chat about. But we used to do something called scintigraphy.
Yes, yeah.
And they would basically, pick up basically where, if we couldn't find a problem. But this kind of relationship really works well with you guys, isn't it? Because this is something where, if there is a lameness and we don't know where it is as a vet, we can refer it to somebody like you, and you'll be able to isolate where the issues are, which can really help us if we need to do further diagnostics.
And quite often it's not a case of isolating, it's more a case of showing patterns through the body, which hopefully we can talk about a bit more as we go along. But generally speaking, by the time any of us get to see a problem, the individual, whether it's a horse or a dog or whatever, is already compensating around that. And by so doing, we've got to look through what we're seeing to see, okay, there's a pattern like this. What's the most likely cause that has led to this animal moving in this way? Because certainly with horses, most of the time they do it when you're not around. So you leave them there fine, you go back the next morning and they're not fine. Or you get your dog races off into the woods and then you hear a yelp or something, and when it comes back it's on three legs and you don't actually know what it's done. And so it's playing detective. And I think, yes, this is where I've always embedded myself within veterinary practices so that we are literally working together on cases. And it's certainly, I think we've helped the animals immensely, but I think we've also helped each other's professions immensely, because we can see what each other's doing and we can also see the thought processes there and then. So I can see how the vet is looking at it, the vet can see how I'm viewing the patient, and then we can sort of get together and discuss and sort of say, well, look, do we need to do a bit of, the vet will say, do we need to do some pain relief, anti-inflammatories, this, that, and the other? Or as you were alluding to earlier, where do you think we need to x-ray this, that, and the other? And yes, I do a lot of thermal imaging on species where we can. And again, I mean, the thermal imaging is great, and it's also frustrating because it can show you what the sympathetic output is doing under the skin via the capillary blood flow under the skin, but it can't tell you exactly what's wrong. And this is where sometimes people get a little bit overexcited and they say, "Oh, I can find pathologies using thermal imaging and this, that, and the other." Well, no, you can't. What you can show is whether you've got an increase or a decreased blood flow under the skin, and therefore you can work out the nerve supply, etc. So you can trace patterns and areas that are maybe functioning differently, but you can't actually say what it is that's wrong. But it does give a very good indicator. If you're looking at a horse that you've been rehabbing and the owner says, "It's moving beautifully now," we can then thermal image it working and actually see which muscle groups it's using and things like that. And so we can either say, yeah, it's working perfectly, or actually, no, it's still dragging itself along, but you're so used to that that you are thinking that that's normal movement for your horse.
So interesting. And, I'm thinking about the relationship with the vet. How often are you, communicating with the vet and linking findings that you have to systemic type of illnesses? Like, I know from, Chinese medicine, there's obviously such a link between meridians and specific organs. And there's also that same thing with the spine, basically, and organs.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
do you ever pick up, working with the vets? And I'm thinking in horses in particular, maybe recurring colics or things like that you've picked up, and you've found something in the horse that is a cause potentially for that.
Yeah, quite often. Colic, maybe not so much, but stomach ulcers, definitely. We see it's somewhere where I'd like to get a study funded, because what I've seen over the last 15 years is an awful lot of the horses we thermal image and watch move and then palpate and treat, where they are really tight at the top of the neck between the mandibles, the temporomandibular joint, occiput, atlas, and axis. And what we find there is, if that has been chronically tight up there for a long period of time, a very high percentage of those horses, if you scope them, have stomach ulcers. And it makes sense when you start looking at the irritation to the vagus nerve and the imbalance between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic system, that it's not rocket science, if you look at it from that point of view, to trace back and go, this could well be affecting heart rate, blood pressure, digestion, etc. And so we have found things there. With dogs, we've found thyroid problems. So hypo and hyperthyroidism, and just trying to think some of the other conditions. I mean, certainly degenerative joint conditions will sometimes show up, and just trying to think some of the other respiratory ones. And I think probably the one that really springs to mind is the stomach ulcers with horses. That is a big one. On a primate level, I did pick up a bunch of gorillas that had an upper respiratory system problem, and their lacrimal glands were just on fire. And so we were able to actually say, no, this whole group actually were either fighting it off or going down with this particular. It's probably the common cold, but it affects gorillas like influenza affects us. It was quite a serious thing, but I was at least able to say, no, I think all of them have got it, so brace yourselves. And that was so different from the normal thermals we've been doing for a musculoskeletal problem with one of the gorillas. And then it was literally, they said, we think they're going down with something. And I said, right, I'll scan the whole lot. And so things like that showed up. Sinus infection, we were able to monitor help the vets monitor the progress in a white rhino. So that was great, a big sort of frontal sinus infection, and it just showed up as this massive hot spot in the middle of its forehead. And then over a period of a few weeks, that just cleared up. And so they didn't have to keep doing blood tests and other things to sort of, and you know what rhinos are like, they're quite sensitive. And so, lots of things like that we've been able to sort of help with.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking in wild animals, it's actually quite convenient thermal
Yeah,
imaging because
yeah,
you don't have to dart them every time to be able to examine them.
yeah.
So are you using thermal imaging on all your patients or just when
No,
needed?
no, just where needed. I mean, I'd love to have the time to use it on absolutely everything, but there are also some of the smaller dogs are they haven't got enough body mass to their fur to actually give a decent reading. So you need animals either with little hair or fur covering, or of a large enough mass that it doesn't matter. So horses, even unclipped horses, will give you a good reading. But if they have been clipped, you then need to make a point of noting that on the report, because you will get different temperature patterns because of the hair length and things like that. But no, it is great. And for the wildlife side of things, or even, I'd say wildlife in the zoo type exotics, where handling often stresses them, so you're going to get an altered response when you put your hands on them, then thermal imaging is a fantastic non-invasive tool, because you can use it all day long and you're not going to hurt the patient. It's just reading that radiated heat coming off the individual.
So being based in the UK, where are you finding all these exotic animals, rhinos and all these animals that you're treating? So are you working with, you guys don't have zoos there, do you?
Yeah, no, we have lots of zoos and
Okay,
safari parks.
okay.
And I'm sort of not quite embedded, but I've been working with the oldest safari park in Europe for a long time. So you've probably heard of Longleat Safari Park. And but several of the other zoos and that. No, we've probably got more rhinos here than some of the African countries now, for all the wrong reasons, really. But it is useful, and it's also useful. I've been trying to show collections that we can actually thermal image pregnant females, whether they're rhinos, giraffe, elephant, things like that. And certainly elephants are difficult, because the anatomy of them is such that you can only usually tell if they're pregnant when they're about to give birth, whereas giraffe, you can see really from the first trimester what's going on. Obviously, zebras are quite easy to do. And again, because they're nervous, they tend to stand away from you. So it's absolutely perfect to get a good thermal image. The giraffe, unfortunately, in collections soon get to realise that you're something interesting, and they'll all come over. And so you start off the first couple of times, you can get some brilliant images, and the next is just a mass of giraffes around, sort of coming around you. But it is really useful because, again, you don't want to have to be sort of running around trying to get urine samples or take bloods from animals that are sort of mostly prey species that get stressed very easily. And just before lockdown, I thermal imaged a black rhino, and it was the first one in, there's a zoo in Wales. I'll give them a quick plug. They're Folly Farm. They are excellent if you're ever over here. And they'd got in black rhinos purely with the intention to breed. And one of the females took and had a very healthy calf. I've yet to go back there to see the calf, but I did thermal image mum during the pregnancy, and there were some really good changes with her compared to the other rhinos they had. So we're beginning to build up this database that hopefully we can use and export so that everybody can have access to it. And these are sort of the dreams for the future, that we can actually show, these things have a great use, but don't try and make out they can do more than they can, because we've had a few issues with thermal imaging in the UK where people have been getting over enthusiastic as to what it can do, and it's caused quite a lot of problems, and legal ones at that we're desperately trying to go, no, when it's done properly, it can be a really useful tool. The latest we're trying is looking at marsupials to see if we can see when a joey has gone into the pouch, because again, when they've only just moved into the pouch, they're very vulnerable. So you don't want people looking in, the chance of infection. Also, mum stitching it or things like that. So we're trying to see if the pouch gets any warmer and at what stage. So it's all exciting stuff.
Yeah, super interesting.
Not what I thought I'd be doing either.
It's just amazing how many different, species of animals, because if I think about in veterinary, there is like 1 or 2 exotic textbooks. But then often you'll just get an animal and you don't know anything about that species, So I take my hat off to you because when it comes to veterinary rehabilitation and osteopathy, you're just looking at the animal and obviously just treating it because there wasn't, should I say, any text about osteopathy until you wrote your textbook. So now's a good time to actually chat about your animal osteopathy textbook. Tell us a little bit about the journey of writing that book and what led you to write it.
Okay, well, basically, it's first off, it's a massive collaborative between 19 osteopaths, vets, and particular animal specialists. And it really came about with what you said. There were no textbooks covering anything other than equine osteopathy. And yet there was a lot that was already being done, treating certainly dogs, cats, rabbits, things like that. But I was also getting to that point where I thought, if I don't get something down in writing soon, it's just not going to happen. And I knew it wasn't going to be easy. I didn't know it was going to take quite as long as it did. From start to finish was nearly 6 years. And that was partly because I was trying to keep a team of 19 of us together. So that was like herding cats. Amongst us all, nearly everybody had some kind of health issue during the writing of the book. So it did start to feel a little bit jinxed. And there were just certain things that life gets in the way and other things like that. But everybody involved was already really busy. But because they were the top of their sort of areas of expertise, we desperately wanted to involve them. So I kept the publishers on board and assured them that if we didn't rush it, we'd actually have a text that we'd be proud of, but also would have a really good teaching benefit to it. And to be fair to them, I was a new author to them. They stuck with us, and we got it done. And it covered it. The one thing it doesn't cover is marsupials and marine mammals, but it pretty much covers everything else that an animal therapist is likely to encounter. And it'll give them the tools to at least go, okay, I've got a basis to work from. Because, like I say, most weeks I get faced with something I haven't treated or thought about looking at before. And then it is that case of, like you say, you're looking for any little sort of ream of information that you can get that will actually assist with what you need to do.
Yeah, so I've got my own copy of it, and I think it actually even doubles up as an exotic rehab book because I don't know any other book that has got so much information about exotics. So for the listeners out there are things about alpacas, flamingos, hedgehogs, like anything and everything you can think about besides marsupials and marine. And I didn't even notice that wasn't there because there were just so many animals in there. I thought you couldn't have missed any out. But it really is so thorough. So I'd like to congratulate you because it really is an amazing, amazing textbook.
Thank you.
The illustrations are also unbelievable. There are so many images, which I always love. I love to see images of things, and everything is just so well thought out. And the structure of the book is really, really great. And I was paging through it, and I looking at. I haven't had a chance to read it from front to back, but I have been reading things here and there. And one of the things that I picked up was a mention about myofascial lines. Now we know something called myofascial chains. Is that the same thing?
It is, yes, effectively. It's the couple that did the research and published. Well, they very kindly agreed to publish it in the textbook. They're based in Denmark, and yes, they call it myofascial lines there. But I grew up in an era when it was fascia was just about being talked about, and then they started talking about myofascial chains. And it really harps back at what we were saying at the beginning of this podcast, where we, in order to unravel a problem, and when you're rehabbing an animal, you've got, if you don't look at the myofascial chains, lines, whatever you want to call them, you're not going to get as good a result as somebody who does. And if any of the listeners have injured themselves, they will know full well what myofascial chains are, because they will have experienced all sorts of weird and wonderful symptoms that they won't necessarily have immediately put down to their original injury. So we often see, if it's a person, you can see somebody who's sprained their ankle and they think it's okay and they carry on. But of course, what they're doing is they're shifting their weight onto their other leg. That goes up through their body, through their shoulders, up into their neck and their head. And then they probably start getting headaches, eye strain. They might even start biting the side of their cheek, things like that when they're eating. And they won't necessarily put any of this down to the fact that they sprained their ankle maybe 6 months or a year earlier. And these are common things. And it's something we see with, especially with the horses, where horses are ridden, they take a fall, they jump up, they've got oodles of adrenaline pumping through their system. They haven't got any fractures, so they're okay. And the jockey gets carted off and has all these amazing tests done and isn't allowed to do anything because, they've probably suffered concussion and all that. But the horses don't get concussion. Horses don't get whiplash, It's just that they are okay because they haven't fractured anything. And of course, what happens is over the next few weeks, their myofascial chains start to adapt and allow them to carry on functioning. And left long enough, it usually leaves them with all sorts of problems. And this is where I think an awful lot of the hock issues and other things like that start to create big issues for them. And even asymmetric loading through the limbs. So you start seeing the feet distorting, where they're basically standing not properly down through that third digit. They're either standing more medially or laterally, and then you see the hoof wall start to push out and things like that. And so you get all these changes that, unless the farrier knows what's gone on and knows what we're doing, and unless the saddler knows what's gone on and what we're doing, and the dentist and all the others, you can end up with all these problems where the horses their arcades start to change shape, and then they can't freely move their mandible when they're cantering and galloping. And so you get a horse then that literally then can't engage from behind properly. And all of that could have come from a simple fall that if somebody just went, right, that horse is going to be like a person with a whiplash, that needs treating. If only that would happen every single time, then these horses would be in much better shape.
Yeah, and it just reminds me the importance of that vet rehab team, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the dentist, the farrier, everyone working together, not just treating each individual thing, actually chatting and talking and communicating, because then you could put all of it together.
Yeah, definitely. And sadly, even in the UK, where we think, we always think we're doing everything great and all that, sometimes the communication chains aren't quite as good as they should be, to put it nicely. And, there are some, I know colleagues that say, the vet isn't going to listen to me and this, that, and the other. Then you get some vets going, well, we need to do this, and they won't consult with anyone else. And it's so frustrating. But when you do get a team that does work together, oh my gosh, do you notice the difference? And it's exponential, I think, the way that suddenly everything becomes a lot easier. Owners find everything much less daunting to do, because they're usually worried. They're concerned that what they're doing is going to make things worse. And it doesn't help if two members of the so-called team are saying completely opposing things to do. And so, yes, it's really waking everyone up to myofascial chains have been there since, we evolved out of the primordial soup. It's not a new thing. It's just that approaching it needs to be sort of really better understood. And also the fact you touched on the acupuncture, the fact that the fascia and the muscles have slightly different nerve supplies. So when you hear some people saying, "Oh, I'm just trigger pointing the myofascia and all that," and you're like, "Well, you're doing one or the other. You're not. You've got to understand that they are supplied slightly differently. They behave slightly differently. Fascia has this tendency when it's under any kind of stress to dehydrate, which immediately affects its ability to morph and work in this three-dimensional pattern as it should. But of course, if fascia around a particular muscle is dehydrated, it's going to be tighter. So therefore, to get that muscle to relax, until you've got the fascia hydrating and doing what it should, you're not going to get that muscle to be able to fully relax and lengthen and reset all of the spindles as they should. And so this is this whole it's a subject within itself, as you well know. There are so many books coming out on fascia and things like that, because people are suddenly waking up to the fact that if you damage the fascia, you've really messed things up. And surgeons in the old days, where they just used to rip through it, it's now are beginning to wake up to the fact that's why those patients get so many weird symptoms and keep talking about discomfort. And we have to recognize that it's exactly the same whether it's a horse, a dog, or a person. The fascia is critical to the musculoskeletal health or general health of an individual.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember just being taught exactly that. Just cut through it, preserve the muscles, and don't worry about the fascia.
It's just that annoying stuff.
There, yeah. But I mean, the topic of fascia it's becoming so much more mainstream. People are talking about it now. And interestingly, it's one of the topics that's coming up a lot at the Vetrehab Summit. So at the end of the year, on November the 14th, we are having the Vetrehab Summit, and our theme is connections, which is basically what fascia is. It's the connector of the body, right? And a lot of the lectures are actually targeted the lecturers are talking about fascia. So for those of you that are interested and want to get some more info, you can go to vetrehabsummit.com and find out more about that.
And on that note, your conferences are incredible, and the stuff you do is amazing. Because to talk about connectivity, you're doing it on a virtual level. You should really be you're the virtual fascial platform, really.
Thanks, Tony. Yeah, I mean, we're really looking this year. When I say it's about connection in so many ways. So connecting all the people. So we've got around the world networking that we're doing. So we're connecting people with companies, connecting people with knowledge. There's so much connection that's going to happen on that day. So thank you for your kind words.
No, they're genuine. But yeah, looking at the fascia, if you look at the horse, one of the big problems you see is if you see a horse where it's holding its head up really high, you've got an imbalance between the superficial dorsal and superficial ventral fascial lines. And by encouraging, if a rider rides such that they're keeping the head of the horse up high, they are going to adversely affect that balance between those two sort of fascial lines. Those will also impact on the other ones. Whereas with dogs, they actually function better with their superficial dorsal line running at a slightly more dominant level, because they are technically a predator. The head is up. That's the way that they move. And it's understanding each species or breed as to what they're like, as to when you're feeling through them, you should feel. I hate it when I see people really pulling animals around, because what I like to do is place my hands on and feel how the tissues want to actually function and what the biases are within that individual. And really, when you're looking at a horse, you want to feel a fairly neutral line between the dorsal fascia and the ventral fascia, relatively. But you also want to see that the spiral lines and they're like the helical ones that go each way round the body. You don't want to feel that one helix is stronger than the other. And pretty much with the dog, but the dog is likely to be much more dominant in the sort of the dorsal one. So the head is up, and they sort of puff their chest out a little bit more, that type of thing. And by doing that, they're altering how the hip flexors and extensors work, etc. And so that's why you usually see dogs standing with back legs slightly further back and the head up, and that's because that balances those lines out. And of course, when you don't see that, when you see a dog that's hunched and it's got its back arched up, its head's down and its bum's down and its legs are tucked under it, you've got a dog with severe imbalance with that. And of course, if that's going on, the fascia doesn't just stop around the muscles, it goes around all the organs, everything in the body. The fascia is connected to it. It is the great sort of all-encompassing organ. And it's understanding that if there's tension through the fascia affecting the musculoskeletal system, it is also going to affect the function of the organs that it also connects with. And therein lies, you start looking at the health of certain breeds. You think of Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, heart problems, respiratory problems, kidney problems. It goes on and on and on. If there's a breeder dog that needs to make sure its fascia's all right, it's going to be your Cavalier King Charles for one, And so it's sort of thinking outside the box. We get in the UK, they're trying to pigeonhole us as musculoskeletal practitioners, but it's sort of like the body doesn't function that way. It functions as a massive team, or like the crew of a ship, and you need every member of that crew to be able to function properly for the health of that individual to be okay. And that's really what I think we assist with. We assist manually by just getting the body back to being able to function as it should as a whole.
For those of you that as Tony was explaining, inside the book, there are actually some amazing diagrams with lines on, with all those myofascial lines. So if what he was saying didn't make exact sense, when you get the textbook, you'll be able to see all of that.
Yes, which obviously we're gearing it so you have to buy the book.
Yeah, we're leaving out a little bit of information. Tony, so what is your favorite topic that you discussed in the book?
Oh God, that is a really difficult one. At one point, I didn't want to discuss any of it because I'd seen too much of it. I think that the thing I loved so much about the book was creating a framework that carried on through each chapter. So if you want to know, say, orthopedic problems in a cat and a dog, and you want to think, I wonder what they're like in reptiles, you know exactly where to navigate into each chapter. And it was the fact we managed to get everybody eventually to adhere to writing in that way. And then we edited to just tidy up the edges. But I think that's the bit I love the most, is that I have one of those, probably more like a bird brain in a sense, where I will think something and I'll go, oh, I actually need to know right now, do gorillas get, what's the etiology of, think of something quick, or I don't know, osteoarthritis in a gorilla, or bone growth, what time, what age do gorillas mature skeletally as opposed to cats and dogs and birds. And so you can flick through and you can quickly do this. So if somebody is using the book as we mean it to be, it's small enough to carry around, but large enough to carry enough data. And what we want is people to be able to dip in and dip out. Well, I genuinely, when we were putting it together, didn't expect anyone to read it cover to cover. It's great cure for insomnia if you want to, but it's really as a reference book, and it's to support the not just the initial study of musculoskeletal manual therapists, but something you take with you, because I can't remember everything now that we put in the book, but just looking through, I know exactly where to find it, and we've deliberately created it to do that. I suppose if I had to pick the chapter I'm probably was the most proud of was the bird chapter, because we had to do so much research, and to create the line drawings that we did took much longer than writing the chapter, because there weren't line drawings that for everything we wanted, that we could go, we can adapt that, we can create this. And so it was, for me, my favorite diagram in the whole book are the air sacs in the bird, because that then, if you treat any birds with any trauma, you can start to understand why they are so different to treating a mammal, in the fact that they don't have a diaphragm, and their whole respiratory system, even with non-flight birds, revolves around them being able to move their pectoral girdle and their wings, and the fact that they've got all these extra air sacs in and around some of the bones. And so if you had a bird that suffered trauma, you've got to start thinking, right, are all those airways actually still intact, and things like that. And so it opens up a whole new dimension.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a great reference book. I mean, even just me having paged through it, I've read little bits. And yeah, you really did do that. It is something that is so easy to be able to find the information, the way you guys set it up. So it's a great buy. So where can people buy the book?
Right. Well, the publishers were Handspring Publishing, and they can be contacted at www.handspringpublishing, all one word.com. They're based in Edinburgh. Fantastic group to actually work with, and very, very supportive. And yes, you can buy the book direct from them. It's also available from every online bookseller as well, so that you shouldn't now have problems getting them. We're getting word through from colleagues in New Zealand and Australia and Canada that their books have all been getting through, despite the present situation. So, and there is the ebook version. So if you don't want to wait for the hard copy, or if you prefer having your textbooks on a tablet, then the ebook version is just as available, and doesn't get so dirty. But I like to annotate things, so I like to have a physical book in my hand.
I'm the same.
Yeah,
I think that, especially as a reference book,
yeah,
I find it difficult to reference.
Yeah.
With the ebook. So we'll put the links to purchase the book for those of you that are interested in the description notes. Tony, thank you so much. It's been awesome chatting to you. And I always learn something new about some different type of animal whenever I speak to you. So in my mind, this was going to be a general osteopathy conversation. And last time we chatted about elephants, and we've chatted about so many things. So primates, the joeys, there's so many little things. So thank you for sharing all the time. I love listening to and learning from you.
Megan, it's always a pleasure. I really do admire everything you've achieved. I think you've achieved so much in a short space of time. And yeah, we're always here to support you as well. I think what you do is absolutely fantastic. Please don't stop, because now we've all found you. We've got this amazing network that we can all tap into and also contribute to. And as ever, it's an absolute delight speaking with you. I just love the fact you've got this enthusiasm for everything that we're all trying to do as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Tony. Have a great day.
And do. Bye.
If you enjoyed this podcast, please hit the subscribe button so you get notified every time I load a new podcast. I'm here every week talking to vet rehab therapists from all over the world about all things vet rehab. For more information about continuing education for vet rehab therapists, you can go to onlinepethealth.com. I'd like to thank you for listening to this podcast, and of course, thank our sponsors, Response System. They are as passionate about therapy lasers and PEMF equipment as you are about veterinary rehabilitation. They would love to answer any questions you have, so please feel free to reach out to them at responsesystems.com, or you can email lisa@responsesystems.com.